She's done a lot of research looking at how climate change and issues related to that impact particularly developing societies. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Diana Liverman, and she will take it away. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a real privilege to speak to this conference, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at the Lundgren Centre and the Norton School for inviting me. My talk's going to focus on the challenges that climate change is posing to consumers and the retail sector, but I want to start with a little bit of an introduction to my new role at the University of Arizona, because it seems like everybody gets to promote their brand, so I want to do that. What I want to tell you about is what a great university the University of Arizona is for research on environmental science and policy. I believe U of A is one of the best environmental universities in the world. We just haven't told anybody about it yet, and that's one of the things we need to do better. We've got environmental expertise literally all across campus, ranging from engineering, earth sciences, social sciences, anthropology, and even our humanities faculty has great environmental writers and poets. So what we're trying to do with the Institute of the Environment is bring this expertise together to get people to work together, but particularly to encourage our faculty to work with stakeholders, both within the state and much more broadly. The flagship themes that we have, and we've got, we think, more than 300 faculty and researchers working on the environment at the university, and this is one of the exciting things about the partnership with the retail program, that we'll be able to leverage off that very broad-ranging expertise. And the expertise includes particularly water, the university in the middle of the desert, ironically, or perhaps quite logically, has more water researchers than any other university in the world. We've also got a big focus on renewable energy, and the university is making big investments in solar. And one of the things we're interested in is how consumers are viewing renewable energy opportunities. We've got some of the world's best experts on climate change, ecosystem conservation, and a whole bunch of other areas. We've also got students who are really interested and concerned in the environment and sustainability. Just the other week, the students proposed a fee. They suggested a fee that they themselves would pay in order to encourage sustainability on campus, and that's gone through. They are hundreds of them taking environmental courses, and many of them are choosing environmental careers. And if you were at the dinner last night, you heard about some of the students in the retail and marketing programs that are choosing projects that have an environmental focus. And I'm particularly excited about the new partnership between the Institute of the Environment and the Program on Consumers, Environment and Sustainability. That's going to, we hope, foster research on consumers and the environment, link student curricula and faculty in consumer science and retail to expertise across the university. And although we look around the country and we see that there are lots of other programs that focus on business and environment, as Anita mentioned, we think that a focus on consumers will provide us with a sort of a unique focus. Now, it's a strong personal interest of mine, because in my previous position as director of the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford University, I developed a program that actually focused on environmental issues in the retail and in the business sector. And that included projects that looked at how climate change would affect the food sector. So I did work with Sainsbury's and Marks and Spencer's, looking at the impact of climate change on their supply chain. And we were also looking at how companies could reduce their carbon footprint, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And there, one of the most exciting things that we did was work with Tesco's to develop some of their new initiatives, and particularly to write the brief for their sustainable consumption initiative. That unfortunately didn't come to Oxford University. It went to Manchester University, which is Terry Leahy's alma mater, and he's the Chancellor of the university. So we forgave Tesco's for going north. But we worked very closely with them to develop that initiative. We also worked with Coca-Cola on water issues, with Cadbury's and with Land Rover on some issues around their emissions. And then I'm going to end by talking about some work we've been doing with the music industry to bring down their emissions. So I'm going to draw on these projects in talking to you about consumers and the challenge of climate change. But because of recent events, I really need to start off by talking to you a little bit about climate science, because we've got a crisis in communicating climate science. And in fact, I've been sitting here watching all of you talk about how you are rebranding and rethinking your products and your brands as you go through an economic crisis. And I think we've got a lot to learn in how we're going to talk to people about climate science. Just a few months ago, it seemed as though everything was lined up for the world to do something serious to reduce the risks of climate change. The international community was going to Copenhagen, ready to sign up for a serious effort to reduce emissions. There were more than 50,000 policymakers, representatives of the private sector, and environmental groups that came together in Copenhagen in December. And we hoped that we would finalize some agreements to reduce the risks of climate change and to help people in the developing world adapt to it. In the US, we also had a lot of the major brands in the US across the full range of sectors who were lining up to support climate and energy legislation. And so, for example, the US Climate Action Partnership was asking the government for mandatory but flexible emission reductions and incentives that would provide a clear and fair signal of a commitment to reduce the risks of climate change. We also had a public that had increasing awareness about climate change, concern, and was looking to government and to the corporate sector to do something about it, and also starting to make changes in their own lives. Now, a few months later, things are a little different. I would not say that Copenhagen was a success. It didn't fail, but there were no binding agreements to cut emissions. The carbon markets are still very shaky, and not enough progress has been made in thinking about how we're going to adapt to climate change. Beginning in November, the theft of emails from the Climate Research Unit at the University of East Anglia in the UK and the discovery of a few errors in some reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the accepted sort of scientific expert body on climate change. The email, which has been called Climategate by many people, and the problems with IPCC fueled a major resurgence in skepticism around climate change. Now, I don't think that it was just the emails and the discovery of errors that have affected sort of willingness to move on climate change. Clearly, the economic recession made individuals and companies less willing to consider any changes that would cost a lot of money. A harsh winter in Europe and in North America, in Eastern North America. Of course, we know the Winter Olympics didn't have any snow because it was very warm, but in Eastern North America, it was a tough winter. And that caused quite a lot of Americans to question the reality of global warming. Now, I'm not going to launch into an extensive defense of climate science or a post-mortem on the infamous stolen emails. The storm of criticism actually focuses on a very few papers and a very few scientists. And what's happening is that there's a small group of skeptics who are enjoying the limelight as a result of the media interest. What I do want to do is to reiterate that climate change is a serious problem and to highlight what we do know and where we are uncertain. And scientists make vast efforts to tell people that these are chances that things are going to happen. We have an 80% confidence that something is happening. We're not telling you that we know this is going to happen. But if you had a 90% chance that your house was going to burn down, wouldn't you do something about it? Even if you had a 60% chance or a 20% chance, you would probably do something about it. So this question of uncertainty is important, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't do anything. So just to summarize what I as a scientist believe and what hundreds of scientists around the world and many CEOs who are very smart people who've looked at this and believe that the science is telling us something important. We know the world is warming. The curves on the left, which on the slide here, are from NOAA. The top one is what's happening to temperature. The second one is what's happening to greenhouse gas emissions. We know that they're moving up. We have dozens of observations that the sea ice is disappearing and that glaciers are disappearing. Just yesterday we had the news that 2 more glaciers disappeared in Glacier National Park, so we won't be able to call it Glacier National Park much longer. We know that species are moving. We've got thousands of scientific studies that show that about 80% of species are moving upslope or are moving towards the poles. We know that our greenhouse gases are continuing to increase despite policy efforts. And we are very confident, although not 100% sure, that if we don't reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, the world is going to get warmer and weather patterns will change. The global scientific consensus on the reality and causes of climate change is extremely strong. The strength of this consensus is a reflection not of ideology or of financial interests. Some of the stuff in the media that suggests that we talk about climate change because we make money from it hasn't ever looked at academic salaries recently. It's the collective weight of thousands of thoroughly reviewed studies that report real-world observations, carefully tested hypotheses, and verifiable measurements. Although we're more certain than we were a decade ago that climate change is happening, we still are open about the many uncertainties. We can't tell you exactly how much the Earth will warm. We can't tell you how fast it will warm. And we can't tell you exactly how climate is going to change in particular places, particularly with regard to rainfall. One cold winter in North America and Europe also doesn't change things. We know that things vary from year to year. The long-term trend still shows us that the last decade has been the warmest on record since records began. However, the media coverage of the emails and a few errors found in IPCC seems to have contributed to a steep decline in public concern about global warming over the last couple of months and a loss of trust in the science. This is survey results from my colleague Tony Leserowitz at Yale University, and they've been doing regular studies about every 3 months on what the American public thinks about climate change. And what you can see here between 2008 and 2010 is a 15% drop in the percentage of the American public that thinks that global warming is happening, down from 70% to less than 60% now. We can also see from Tony's latest study that less people now think it is caused by humans than they did 2 years ago. So more people now are saying climate change is a natural phenomenon, our actions don't have anything to do with it. So what's going on here? Is this just the media and the skepticism about climate change? Is it the recession that is making people worried that climate change may mean they've got to do something to change their lifestyle? Is it a cold winter? What's going on? But I would say that this isn't a seismic shift. Even though there's a drop in concern, the majority of the American public is still worried about climate change. The majority think it's happening, and the majority want the government and the private sector to do something about it. But for scientists, we are feeling a little wobbly. The result that really bothers my scientific colleagues is the decline in trust in science and a loss of trust in scientists as a source of information about global warming. The distrust in science has increased quite dramatically, and the scientific community places great value on their role as honest brokers, with standards that they maintain by peer review. The surge in criticism of climate science and the loss of trust in science as a source of information has left many of my colleagues quite shell-shocked. Two of our colleagues at the University of Arizona have actually been identified as climate criminals and are receiving hate mail on a regular basis. And we really don't know how to react. The scientific community, including the National Academies of Sciences and many who are advising the private sector, are all reflecting on what to do and where our communication has failed. And that's where we need help. And sitting through this conference makes me realize that you guys could help us think about how to communicate. I think we've got parallels in the corporate world where respected and successful brands and companies, and Toyota comes to mind, find themselves in a whirlwind of media and public criticism and must regain the public trust. However, unlike major brands, science doesn't have the public relations and marketing skills to respond and could really benefit from your advice. Now, we have done a bit of thinking about things, and we do realize that part of the problem is our jargon. We've realized that overly scientific jargon hasn't helped, and we're rethinking some of the key messages. For example, if we started talking about climate change in terms of degrees Fahrenheit rather than degrees C, it might have more meaning to the American public who doesn't understand what 2 degrees C warming might be. So we're starting to talk about the world warming 3.5 degrees F as opposed to 2 degrees C. We're starting to say that observations are showing a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature rather than half a degree C. We also realize that we're not addressing people individually and personally. We keep talking about global issues and very, very large-scale changes, and what we really need to do is to talk about what it means for people's everyday lives. My institute at Oxford recently produced a report that really did have an impact because it talked to people's everyday lives. It was a report on climate change in the English garden. And if there's one thing that is at the heart of British culture or certain segments of British culture, it's their garden. And the gardeners are the ones that are noticing that things are changing. We had more demand for that report than any of the more abstract, less individual reports that we'd put together. The one thing that does still seem to work as an icon is the polar bear. Even though it's distant, it has become an icon for communicating the risks of climate change. So one of the things we're doing at the Institute is trying to come up with new graphics for our website that would be better communication. So this is one we're trying for the Arizona community. It's a thermometer that shows how warm southern Arizona might get as we go out 2020, 2050 in the southwest. And we remembered to put it in degrees F rather than degrees C. And when you start looking at that and you live in southern Arizona, you get worried. It's hot enough here already. What will it be like if or what will it be like for our children, particularly if it's 6 degrees warmer over the next 20 years, particularly because we know if it's hotter, we're going to have less water. Now, although the public has lost confidence in climate change and climate scientists, so far as I can tell, the corporate commitment to action on climate change has not faltered as much as the public has. Although to the extent that business action on climate change is in anticipation of government regulation, that seems less likely now, or is sensitive to economic conditions, or is responsive to changing consumer concerns, we might expect some adjustment in the corporate commitment. But research that we've done at Oxford with some of the major stakeholders in the UK suggests that the other drivers of corporate action on climate change are still very relevant and important. Shareholder interest, particularly socially responsible investment concerns, are still keeping the corporate attention on climate change. Some of the leaders of major companies, and of course here we do have companies like Walmart and others who have taken leadership on climate change. In the UK, we find that the executive commitment is still very high. And people are seeing that acting on climate change actually saved them money. So when they've put in energy efficiency, they've done better. So it seems as though the business case for action on climate change has been sustained. And in some cases, the interest is increasing. And in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to talk about some research I've done with particular companies that is addressing some of their concerns around climate change. So let me now talk about some of the issues that have been relevant. The first one is the work that we've done on how climate change might affect the supply chains for major retailers around the world, and it's the question of how climate change might affect the availability of agricultural and food products. So there are people here from the cotton industry who perhaps might be worried that climate change is going to affect their supply chains. If you work for a major company that deals with the food sector, that would be of concern. And the first thing I want to say is up until 2000, things were looking pretty good in terms of global agriculture. Yields of the basic grains, wheat and corn and rice had been increasing. There were other very rapid shifts in the food system, so we were seeing a lot of consolidation and obviously looking at the role that Walmart and Tesco are playing as major retailers globally now. It's important. We've got more global supply chains, and that, of course, means you've got to worry about climate change, not where you are, but in distant parts of the world where you're purchasing from. And we've seen a big increase in the sort of private sector self-governance. So things like organic, fair trade, other certification has become more important. But then in the last decade, things have started to look a little more worrisome. And as many of you know, in 2007, 2008, we actually had a food price crisis worldwide that increased hunger by 300 million people worldwide. Particularly in Asia, increased meat and dairy consumption was meaning that more grain was being fed to livestock. And all of this contributed to the big blip in prices. The good news here is if you look at the graph, the prices have gone down. And what this shows is how incredibly adaptable agricultural producers are when they're getting the right prices. And so this suggests that even if climate does change, we've got a very innovative sector when we look at the food sector. But the question that we're asking is, what are the limits to that adaptability? They may be able to put on a certain amount more water, use a certain amount more inputs, do some sort of switching of varieties, but perhaps we'll get to the point where there's a limit to that sort of adaptability. It wasn't just the basic grains. Your basic breakfast beverages have also increased dramatically in price over the last few years. So whether it's sugar, coffee, citrus, all of these have seen big increases in prices. And again, I'm not saying that these are climate related, but they are suggesting that our food system is reaching some of its limits. What I can show you is some of the work that we've done to look at what would happen if we don't do anything about global warming, what would happen to global agricultural production. And this is just one graphic where the beige and the red countries are ones where yields are forecast to decline quite seriously, from 15 to 50% in all of those areas that are shaded in the dark red. Now, there are areas where yields will increase, and the question is, can we restructure the global food system so as to relocate agriculture in those areas where yields will increase? Now, this sort of research was of interest to companies that source in some of these regions. So Cadbury's is very worried about West Africa. Illy Cafe we've worked with, who's worried about coffee-producing areas. Coca-Cola is extremely worried about what's going to happen to global water supplies and to sugar production worldwide. And they're starting to think about how they could help their suppliers adapt to and cope with climate change. But as I said, when you're looking at a productivity decline of 50%, you've got to really worry about whether we have the capacity to adapt. And so we're starting to look at breeding new varieties, much more efficient farming, having to, unfortunately, move into areas that are currently protected where it might be easier to grow crops in a warmer climate. But you've also got to compete with biofuels and potentially with sea level rise. Bring it a little closer to home, these are some of the forecasts of what might happen in California. The big gray is truth in advertising. It's the uncertainty associated with all the models that we're using for this research. But this shows that by 2080 in California, if we don't do something, we're going to have problems with wine, grapes, avocados, oranges. All of these will see declines in production. So that's a couple of examples about how climate change might affect supply of key commodities that appear in the retail sector. And of course, it also affects other commodities such as timber and fibers. Now, what I'd want to do is to turn a little bit to, okay, if we're worried about these sorts of changes and what they might mean for ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren, what can we do about stopping global warming? How could we reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And I just want to talk a little bit about my experience in the UK working with some of the major retailers. And one of the things that was so interesting during the last 5 years in the UK was the way in which the major grocery chains and retail chains were competing to be the greenest. So there was a big battle between Marks and Spencer's, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, all trying to capture the green consumer. There was also, though, a lot of concern and a growing concern about the vulnerability of these brands if their green claims were not legitimate. And this is where they turned to the universities for scientific research to try to make sure that the decisions they were making could be supported by the best science, and particularly with the British media, which is vicious, that there would be people who would be willing to step up to defend some of these decisions that were being made in the retail sector. Another thing that was happening was a proliferation of labels and a lot of consumer confusion over what these different labels mean. So what about if you've got a product in Marks and Spencer's that has a label saying it's got an airplane on it and it's got a fair trade label on it? So do you feel guilty about it being flown and all the carbon emissions, or do you buy it because it's fair trade and it helps someone poor in the third world? And so we did some research trying to sort out how consumers might understand this proliferation of labels. And just in general, for companies that were trying to do comprehensive carbon management, we wanted to look at what would be the best science that they could use for carbon footprinting, what sorts of uncertainties were associated with that. Because there are a lot of consultancies out there that will tell you they can do your carbon footprint, and the one test of whether they've done a good job is whether they give you any error bars. And most of what is given you is like a particular number. And that probably means it wasn't done using very good science, because there's a lot of uncertainty. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we did with Land Rover and Cadbury, which was mainly around carbon offsetting, and then a little bit about some of the work with Tesco and Marks and Spencer's. The work that we did with Land Rover and Cadbury's was around the issue of carbon offsetting. The reason that Land Rover wants to offset its emissions is it's a sports utility company. Their whole brand is around being an off-road vehicle. And until they can put into place the technologies to reduce their emissions, they wanted their customers to have the option of compensating for their emissions. So if you buy a Land Rover in Europe now, the first 3 years of driving, you pay a small amount on the purchase price. And that goes into projects that reduce emissions in other parts of the world to compensate for your driving. Cadbury's wanted to be they're a very socially responsible company, which was part of the reason they were having the tensions with the takeover by Kraft. But what Cadbury's wanted to do was be carbon neutral so that they could be seen as a responsible company. When they looked at their carbon footprint, 70% of their greenhouse gas emissions are from the cows for milk chocolate that are produced right around the factory. And if you know anything about greenhouse gases, the methane that cows produce, it's one of the, unless we re-engineer the cow, we're going to have a hard time getting those greenhouse gases out of milk chocolate. So what Cadbury's wanted to do in order to stay Cadbury's, they too thought, well, we better find a way to offset the emissions from the milk production, and we'd like to do that in ways that are socially responsible. So carbon offsetting, you buy credits to compensate for the emissions that you're unable to reduce or you are unwilling to reduce. And normally, the way it works is you pay a small amount for credits that are generated by projects that reduce emissions in the developing world. And one of the reasons the offsets are popular in the developing world is making a carbon reduction project is actually cheaper in the developing world. And the reason this is legitimate scientifically is the atmosphere doesn't care where you take the greenhouse gases out. They don't care if it's in Tucson or in southern Mexico, because the atmosphere mixes. So anywhere you can reduce greenhouse gases, it helps reduce the risk of climate change. Now, the problem was that there was a backlash against carbon offsetting in the UK, and there's also a little bit of one emerging in North America. And the attack on offsetting was undermining the brands that were promoting carbon offsetting, like Land Rover, and it was also undermining consumer confidence in individuals buying carbon offsetting. So the criticisms were that a lot of these offset projects weren't really working properly scientifically. They weren't taking emissions out of the atmosphere. They weren't well verified. They were sort of dodgy projects. But there was also an ethical argument that it's unethical to keep on consuming and to pay someone else off for reducing your emissions. And there was this analogy made to medieval indulgences where you'd pay indulgences for your carbon sins. And this attack, and there was also suggestions that the projects were undermining communities in the developing world. And so this was creating quite a lot of problems. So what we did was take on some scientific research projects, because there was very little solid research that had been peer-reviewed out there on carbon offsets and carbon offset projects. And quickly, some of the findings from the research that we did on offsetting found that many of the offset projects were legitimate and were providing benefits to communities. So Land Rover had some projects that were giving out more efficient wood stoves to poor women. Those were reducing emissions, and they were also helping women's health and children's health because of the reduced air pollution. But we also found projects that were really quite dodgy. They were additional, they weren't being well monitored, and they weren't benefiting the local community. So when you're doing carbon offsetting, you really need to look at the project, at the technology, and how well it's monitored. The other really interesting thing that we found was that the media had said that the people who were doing offsetting were the lazy, sort of irresponsible consumers, that companies that were doing it because they didn't want to sort of really do anything serious about climate change. And what we found was that the individuals and the firms who offset were actually the ones that were doing the most to reduce their own emissions as well. So they were doing offsetting after they'd made a serious effort to reduce their own emissions. And then finally, we found that people were incredibly confused, both about what offsets meant and about the variety of labels that were being put on. In order to try to legitimate offsets, the offset companies and a number of businesses have come up with standards that say, yes, this is a good offset, it is providing sustainable development benefits. So you've got a gold standard, you've got the voluntary carbon standard, and consumers didn't really know what those meant. And so one of the things that we were trying to do was to provide guidelines for actually educating consumers and showing that the offsets were legitimate. The final example I'll talk about is some work that we've been doing on climate change with the music industry. And this came from, again, a media backlash in the UK. A number of major artists, such as Coldplay, for example, do stand up for environmental issues and have made efforts to reduce the impact of their tours and to promote more environmentally conscious music industry. And the media had discovered, for example, that Coldplay had paid to have some trees planted in India, and they had, those trees in fact had died, and so Coldplay was called out and called a real fraud. Well, the music industry, who of course makes their profit from these artists, wanted to make sure that in fact their artists were standing on stronger ground when they went out and talked about climate change. And so there's an NGO called Julie's Bicycle that was formed to help the music industry reduce their emissions, and it has some of the major music players in the UK and in fact worldwide, groups like the CEOs of Festival Republic, EMI, Live Nation 19, these were all groups that came together to try to figure out what they could do about the climate change issue. And they came to us to ask us to prepare some scientific studies so that they could understand as a first step what the emissions were from the music industry. And the public tends to think, oh, it's those artists, it's U2 driving around with 30 trucks and 2 airplanes that is the problem. But if you actually look at what we found that the largest share of emissions from the music industry, if you look at their whole supply chain, was from audience travel to gigs, not artist travel, and also the packaging of CDs, the use of plastic cases for CDs. And the little graphic up there shows the audience travel as the biggest share, CD packaging, music venues, the energy used in music venues, and that, in fact, the touring buses and flights was a fairly small share of the emissions. We then did follow-up studies, and I mean, the way we did these estimates, fairly standard, life cycle analysis, carbon analysis, we got energy bills, we did a sort of sample study to get all segments of the industry, and used that using standard conversion factors to come up with the emissions. We've done follow-up studies which have involved actually talking to consumers. When we talked about, just one example, we talked to people who were buying CDs outside a music store to see if they would have any objection to moving from a plastic to a cardboard case. The only market segment that didn't want a cardboard case was young men who were obsessive about lining up all their plastic jewel cases, or who couldn't get cardboard cases when they were drunk. They thought the plastic cases were easier to open when they had too much to drink. But everybody else was quite willing to move to a cardboard case. And what was really exciting for us as university researchers was how quickly the music industry responded to our results. Within a year of First Step coming out, they formed working groups, and there will be an announcement that, at least in the UK, all of the major players will switch from plastic CD cases to cardboard. There are some supply problems in them doing that, but they've decided to do it because it'll reduce packaging emissions by 90%. They're increasing the use of renewable energy and LED lighting. They're changing the times of major gigs so that people can use public transport. They're incentivizing carpooling to big music festivals. You'll get in the front if you come in a carpool. And they've created the industry green mark, which artists, manufacturers, the whole industry will use to show that they've made a serious commitment to carbon emission reductions. So that was really an exciting project to be involved in, and we're now hoping to move it out into North America. Like you, we're trying to understand our market segmentation as environmental researchers, and I just wanted to show you 2 recent studies that help us understand that we can't treat consumers as one group. You guys know that. Climate scientists and climate researchers probably didn't. This is a study from the UK that looked at segmentation in terms of how people link climate change issues to major brands. And you can see that we've got about 29% who, in UK language, are called the greenies. We've got the committed greenies and the aspiring greenies. And then we've got this middle group who only believe in collective action or think that business should do all the work. And then we've got this group of sort of 20% that here are called the naughty skeptics. These are the people who don't want to do anything about climate change. The recent study out of Yale by Tony Leserowitz, and this is going to be incorporated into a study we're doing for Congress called America's Climate Choices, found that you could segment the American public into 6 Americas in terms of their views on climate change. So we've got the alarmed and concerned, ranging down to the doubtful and dismissive. But here again, we've seen shifts over the last few months because of this backlash against climate change, where the alarmed has dropped. I mean, perhaps it's good that people aren't alarmed anymore and having nightmares, but will this translate into unwillingness to act on climate change? And you can see a big increase in the dismissive category from 7% of the population to 16%. So this again is a challenge for climate science to think about what drove this change in the clustering of the market that we're looking at in terms of understanding and action on climate change. So just to wrap up, I've just identified a few opportunities that I think there are for environmental researchers, whether it be in universities or in think tanks, to partner with the retail sector and with the private sector around climate change. I think I've tried to show you that quite a lot of these steps that the private sector is taking can be undermined, and there can be a backlash if they're not underpinned by really good science. So we've got to keep doing really good science and being honest with the public and with the private sector about the uncertainties. I think we can work together to give people more sustainable choices, cheaper choices, and I know that many of the companies that are here are working to do that. We also would like to see a bit more editing of choices so that you can't actually make an unsustainable choice. And this was one of the differences between Tesco and Marks and Spencer's. Tesco has decided to carbon label all their products and make the consumer decide what's the right product to get. Marks and Spencer's has decided to green their whole supply chain and make a whole set of steps where the consumer would know by going to Marks and Spencer's that they would be getting more sustainable products. We need to work on communication. And I think this last issue of working with the market segments, both in terms of their environmental attitudes and in terms of their consumer preferences, I think is an important area for partnership and research. So I'll end there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you. If there are any, I can't see very well, so. Nope. Yeah, I'm happy. I'll be around after if anybody wants to talk
Actually,
to me.
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Back here. I was wondering if Americans are more skeptical than other people from other countries, and in the 6 Americas, are you seeing any? Is it regional? Is it red states versus blue states? Is it north versus south, or anything? Are you seeing any regional changes?
Yeah. Americans are more skeptical than most other countries in the world and have been less concerned about climate change. And the research community has done a lot of sort of thinking about why that might be. It's partly the geography of the US, where global warming has not been experienced as much as it has in Europe, for example. We're not actually seeing the changes as strongly as they are in Europe. But I think there are other factors going on. I think Americans are more skeptical about science, and this has partly to do with debates around evolution and creationism, and climate change is being linked to those. In terms of regional attitudes, the normal thing is that the coasts are more environmentally concerned than the middle, and the south is least so. But I'm not sure that, I think working on the American public in general and trying to understand them in general is probably not what we need to do. I think we need to really look much more in depth at these different groups in society and understand what's driving their attitudes. And, there are strong correlations between income and environmental concern. We also know that women are far more concerned about climate change than men are in almost every survey that's undertaken. In North America, I think part of what's going on is environment is a partisan issue, whereas in most European countries it's not. So in the UK, the 3 major political parties, along with the 3 major retailers, are all competing to be green as well. So I think that there are some interesting explanations there. But I would say, I've just had a student complete a dissertation on evangelical Christianity and climate stewardship, and the evangelical community is now taking climate change very seriously. So one can't stereotype different segments on climate change, I think. Yes. Yeah, there are people that say that, but the study we did was quite comprehensive, and the problem for the evangelical community on climate change is the association between science and evolution, and the association with Al Gore, who they really hate. So if Al Gore would stop talking about climate change, it might actually help American attitudes. I like Gore, but
You mentioned the media, and certainly, you know, as consumers, we're influenced. And you talk about the change, the shift now, and we're seeing, I guess, the other side, and a push perhaps against this, and as you mentioned, some other things happening right now with the emails. Go back 5, 6, 7 years, and I think the media was saying, wow, I think we have a real issue out here, and everybody's paying attention. That's why your numbers were the other way 5, 6, 7 years ago, with the consumers and the general population buying into this and feeling like we have a real issue. But the consumer gets these mixed signals. How can we know in the scientific community, do we believe these guys? Do we believe these guys? Is there ever going to be more unanimity, some more consolidation within the scientific community so the general population can feel better about where they should put their trust?
well, we have done some studies of the media and climate change. My colleague Max Boykoff at University of Colorado found that the major problem is just with the way media covers things anyway, and I'm sure this is true of the way the media covers the retail sector. They always have to have balance, so you've always got to have the pro person and the negative person. And even if the pro person's got, 90% of all scientists behind them, and the other guy's only got 10, it looks like it's an equal debate. And so I think part of what happens is that the media always tries to have these arguments and these fights. And in fact, I watched Colbert report the other night, and he constructed a fight over climate change just for pure entertainment. But I think the other thing that's happening with the media is that there's actually sort of burnout. There were too many climate change stories. There were too many pathetic-looking polar bear stories. And the media was looking for controversy. And so when there was fraud, and scientists are sort of so pure and wonderful that when you found that scientists has written rude emails to each other, that was news. And so I do think that the media is looking for a news angle as well. But the idea that these guys here have equal weight to these guys here, one has to decide how one assesses the number of scientists that believe on one side and the group that is arguing the other view. And it probably, one way to think about that would be in terms of probability. That if we got 90% of the scientific community thinking this and 10% thinking this, we've probably got a 90% chance that it's going to happen. And there again, I think it comes back to risk management. What are we willing to spend? What are we willing to do to respond to what looks like a fairly high risk?